I'm on. Okay. Hello, everybody. My name's Pat. I'm sure I didn't hear the intro. I'm sure it was nice. So thank you. I'm gonna introduce myself and just try to explain what I've been doing down at City Hall the last couple weeks. I'd rather sort of get into a Q&A. I know there's time for that, but I don't really like public speaking, and I don't like hearing myself talk. So I'd rather answer sort of direct questions than just kind of prattle on. You guys get enough lectures. I'm from Philadelphia. I grew up right around 69th Street. My parents now live in Havertown, so I'm sort of a stone's throw away. I went to sort of the DuPont Pavilion to see a couple. It's called the Pavilion now, right? Yeah. I went to the Pavilion to see basketball games as a kid, so I'm sort of familiar with this neighborhood. I went to high school here. I went to college at Georgetown. Yes. So you guys will have to forgive me, but just to sort of put it out there, my dad, my uncle, my brother, my best friend, and several other people I know went to Villanova. So as far as I'm concerned, there's no real bad blood. Right now, I am an English teacher at Delaware County Community College, and I'm also a rowing coach. I coach down on Boathouse Row. I sort of have popped around a little bit. I've coached in Chicago and Boston and New York. My last job was with a program called Philadelphia City Rowing, which was designed to get minority students and underprivileged kids out on the river. I don't know if you guys have ever been down there, but rowing is statistically a very white, rich, elite sport, and I had the good fortune of doing it being white, but neither rich nor elite. So it was a sort of an entertaining experience for me, and it's also sort of another entertaining experience to see what that looks like going from the high end of social wealth to the low end of social wealth. So that's sort of a little bit about me. What I've been doing down at the Occupy tent, or the occupation at City Hall, I went down, I knew some friends that were involved with the pre-planning of it, and I was just like, sure, sounds like a good idea. I sort of read what was going on Wall Street, and I agreed sort of with the fundamental premise of pushing for a fairer and more just society. So I went down there to sort of check it out, but also to sort of kind of jump right in. And I just brought a couple books down. Like I said, I'm a lit professor. I like reading. So I brought a few books down that I felt would really kind of contribute to the conversation, to sort of keep some facts on hand. And then after 3 or 4 days of just sort of passing around 10 books, we evolved into a book exchange where we've been giving out books. People have been donating books, and we've, since the occupation started, we've given out about 4,000 books to just people coming through and really just sort of doing conversation. I've also sort of been helping out with the education committee, which is, again, sort of on the lines of informed dialogue. There's, I'm sure you guys are more aware than most, but we live in a very sort of integrated, complex society, and the globe is it's kind of like a small, big idea. You know, everybody's like, oh, it's one planet, but there's 7 billion people, and there's 200 some odd countries, and there's sort of a lot going on. And so as part of the education committee, we're working on, like I said, informed discussion. It's really hard to talk about very complex economic systems, very complex social systems, very complex sort of anthropological movements in society without sort of having the right data. And even, we just hit the milestone of 7 billion people on the planet, and it's tough to sort of get all those numbers straight. And when we start talking about bank bailouts and auto bailouts, and it's like billion this and 5 million that and 200 trillion that, and the numbers are sort of a headache. And so even though I'm not an economist, and I actually I was 1 for 2 as far as math classes in college, but we've been sort of working on just getting everybody to make sure they have their numbers straight, to make sure that that people are aware of how statistics break down, and sort of like what kind of world we're living in. And so they're sort of really cool. We've got some sort of like really mini tables and some chairs, and we sit around, and a couple Villanova professors have been down there, a couple Penn professors have been down there, a couple guys that used to work at investment banks have been down there, and it's a really sort of an interesting environment in terms of coming down and being able to sort of pick a fight and have a conversation and defend your own defend your own ideas on how to make a better world with sort of like an unofficial referee in the background somewhere being like, can you cite that statistic? Do you actually know that for a fact? And it's kind of a, I don't know, it's an interesting platform to have discussions on. I'm not really an expert on anything, so that's not really what we're pushing down there as far as expertise. We're just sort of pushing an environment where it's okay to talk about things, it's okay to question the data, it's okay to sort of examine further where reports are coming in and stuff like that. So that's been my experience. It's been a good one. And like I said, I'm here to more or less answer questions and hopefully fill you guys in a little bit about what's going on down there in Tent City. So. And you can be cruel. I'm good with questions. If you don't like what we're doing, please ask me. If you don't. Yeah, you seem like a rough group.
Yeah. So, what would you like to see actually change in Philadelphia?
In Philadelphia, I mean, I'm the son of 2 teachers, and I have 6 aunts that teach in the public school system, and I have friends that teach in the public school system. Just one of the interesting statistics: we have 38% dropout rate every year. There's 300,000 high school students in Philadelphia, and it's getting worse. I am down there primarily for education. I think in terms of like how much money we have, the largesse we experience as Americans, it's sort of reprehensible. We're 18th in the world in overall education, behind Costa Rica, which our GDP is 14 trillion. Theirs is 35 billion. So that's kind of, we have a whole lot of money. And yeah, there's some sort of population discrepancies there, but we have a lot and they have a little, and they're doing better educating theirs than ours. So my sort of primary concern is an educational mandate, because I think one of the simplest solutions to like all of society's woes would be to pay teachers more and to keep schools funded better than they are right now. So I mean, Philadelphia cut, I think it's 20% of the education budget. They're also building 3 new prisons. I don't think those are disconnected. So.
As a teacher, would you agree, or would you support getting rid of tenure and like if you were to increase like a teaching salary based on like how well they're teaching? So kind of like correlate it that way rather than teaching or paying the teachers that are there for longer more?
I don't necessarily agree with the tenure system. I think it's sort of a tough thing. I think the biggest problem right now in education is you're not attracting the right type of people to education. Education, in my experience, has been a fallback position for most people, where they're like, oh, I didn't get this, I didn't get that, I can always teach. And that seems like a really weird stance for a society to take in terms of how we drive our future. I think that it's unrealistic. When you look at where people go out of school, out of college, Bear Stearns, or the big investment banks never have trouble recruiting people because they pay well. And even though it takes 6 or 7 years to go through medical school to become a doctor, people are always becoming doctors. There's never a shortage of people who want to do well-paying jobs. And I think that's sort of just a reality that when you look at that, there's not a lot of people that are really stoked about $30,000 a year jobs. There's not a lot of people that get fired up for like iffy healthcare and sort of like tough teaching positions. I think there's a lot of things that should be tied into merit. I think it's tough to do it specifically just on teacher performance, because realistically we need the best teachers in the worst schools. And if you tie it too closely to student performance, you're going to see there's going to be a sort of a tough transition in terms of how that works out right away. So I would say I'm not like wild about tenure. I don't think showing up all the time should, gradually increase until you hit the max. But I think there's, in terms of like innovative thinking, I think it would be important to sort of do it in a way to increase the pay rate of teachers in a way that doesn't always tie them to the performance of the kids ties them more to the personal performance. I also think when you pay people more, you can expect more of them. So instead of teaching like 8 or 9 months, I think it would leave more room for personal development. It would leave more room for professional development. It would give teachers an opportunity to take 4-week classes over the summer and still be sort of paid for that. I don't know a single teacher that doesn't take a summer job. So there's just sort of there's sort of a balance that would have to be struck in terms of how you're doing that, obviously.
I know this is kind of secondhand, but my roommate, she does PCH, Philadelphia Community Outreach to homeless individuals.
Okay.
And so every Monday night she goes down and like to like suburban stations in certain areas and talks to the homeless people on the street. And a lot of them, in kind of response to the Occupy movement, have found it it's negatively impacting them in a lot of ways because there's more of like the police concentration. Like a lot of the big problem that she says a lot of them are saying is their stuff is being moved or stolen, which when all they have is a blanket and it's getting cold like that freak snowstorm we had. I mean that's a really big problem for a lot of them, and some of them like I guess the permit or something is coming up soon and they were afraid of like violence kind of breaking out. And just how do you kind of describe like that negative repercussion maybe on people who have been there?
I think it's really interesting. We have the 3rd largest homeless population in the country. It's 42,000, I think, and that's a fluctuating statistic because it's always impossible to figure out exactly how many people are homeless. I find it like really kind of amusing how concerned the city and the media are now with our city's homeless as opposed to a month and a half ago when nobody really cared about them. There's a valid concern for how they feel about the area that's being used down there. Realistically, there's been the homeless paper put out a story on how this has actually given the homeless an opportunity to set up shop. I think the city's more concerned about them staying and fighting for their space more so than the occupiers. There's a sort of an even split. I would say there's 50% of the people in those tents are homeless and 50% are not, or in some other station in life. And so I think the numbers are we've been feeding close to 1,500 people a day, 3 square meals. I think there's a lot of people that have taken donations and tents and stuff. So as much as there is a backlash, there's a lot of really positive things being done for the homeless down there. I also think it's doing a really good job of highlighting some of the issues with the homeless down there. So I know this doesn't sort of help the individuals that do feel put out by it, but in terms of the long run, in terms of solving the blight of homelessness in our city, this is going to be really positive because the people that go down there, even just passing through, have no choice but to face what homelessness is. It's sort of, I mean, it's like Hooverville in a way, where people without any other choice are just gathering, and that's always been. It's just right now it's on really expensive property. So.
What are some of the rights and the responsibilities of people who participate in the occupation? What is expected of them, and what's that relationship?
It's really interesting. In terms of sort of demands, we're in a it's tough. We're sort of transitioning between theoretical and practical, between ideas of true democracy and the actuality of true democracy. Someone was sort of pushing an idea of like an open Congress for everybody. It's like there's 307 million people. How do you operate that, right? So people are sort of asking as a base tenant for what everybody's expected down there, first and foremost is just respect, is to try to respect the people that are down there, whether they're homeless or not, try to respect what people are saying, whether they're crazy or not, and try to just give people the room to talk. It's become a really great place for a conversation because there is that presupposition where you're going to listen to me regardless of what I have to say. And we've run into some sort of issues with that because when a mentally ill homeless person takes the mic and starts talking, there's a great deal of respect floating around, but there's not a lot being said. So I think there's the sort of needs and or wants of the movement as a whole is sort of running up against the theoretical nature of these things. It's easy to say you want to respect everybody. It's easy to say that you want to give everybody a voice, but practically putting that into action is tough. So to answer your question, we're just asking people to come down with a lot of respect and an open mind and a pretty high degree of patience, because it's one of those sort of double binds of the internet age where everyone can gather really quickly, but hearts and minds still change at the same speed. So.
What do the people down there right now plan on doing after the permit runs out?
That's actually going to be voted on tonight at 7 o'clock. It's sort of, it's a tough thing. I mean, I don't know what's going to happen. It's a lot of the decision depends on what exactly we're doing, whether we're trying to sustain long-term activism in Philadelphia, whether we're trying to elicit a confrontation from the mayor's office, whether we're trying to perform civil disobedience and legitimately be a disturbance. In my opinion, we've been sort of thrown this like grapefruit softball kind of thing where they're putting a $50 million ice skating rink on public property. I'm pretty sure it was a no-bid contract, and it's going to a private developer who will own the leasing rights for that land for the next 20 years. So federal tax dollars are paying a private company to build an ice skating rink, when in the city of Philadelphia there's nothing more we need than an ice skating rink. So again, there's this, the question of whether we stay or whether we go depends on really what we're there for, what we're trying to do. There's a group there that really wants to get arrested and really wants to sort of draw the confrontation out. There's a group there that thinks we should shift everything and go across the street. And there's a really big group in the middle that is trying to sort of understand the nuances of power politics and what it means to move and what it means to stay. What are we going to do? I have no idea. You know, I'm just one dude in the middle of 3,000 people, so it's sort of tough.
What do you think it would take for you to say like Occupy was successful? Just like
I actually think Occupy has already been successful, just based on the amount of conversation that people are having, sort of across the world. I think this is a really interesting opportunity, and it's a really interesting point in our history where it's almost like if you don't think something is wrong, then you're really not paying attention. And I think this is sort of forcing people to take a stand on that, to say like, and not in like I'm with them, I'm against them, I'm sleeping down there, I'm not sleeping down there. I don't think it's really that deep. I think it's, are we going to allow a dissatisfied section of the population to voice their opinions while exercising their First Amendment rights, or are we going to ask them to leave and ask them to like shut up and suffer quietly? So in the way that I think this movement has changed the nature of social discourse, I think it's already been successful. I think it's also done a really good job of individual empowerment. I think that one of my favorite like parts of the world, and this is, you guys are gonna think I'm a little twisted, it's a little dark, but I think it's really funny in a way that this has happened because we've allowed it to happen. We are participants in our own disaster. We give banks money, we buy stuff from corporations that use sweatshop laborers, we eat foods that are made in laboratories, we eat meat that comes from factories. So, and these are all things that happen, you know, and they're on the front page of the New York Times. You know, they're all, and the government isn't even hiding anymore. We have troops on the ground in like 72 countries. You know, we were in 3 wars just a month ago, and these are things that, you know, it's sort of interesting how the momentum of the American Goliath just sort of soldiers through all these things, because I think like right now people are like looking at it and they're feeling sort of like cheap. They're like, You know, like I sold out for a Toyota Camry and a DVD player. And I think that's like really kind of funny, but really kind of sad. And it's, I don't know if that answered your question, but in terms of like success, I think people are talking about problems, people are engaging with solutions, and people are sort of creatively discussing. I think it's successful because there's a group of people that no longer feels powerless. And I think those people, I think as a group, whether they pack up their stuff and go home today, a month from now, when the first snowstorm hits, I don't care, because I think they've sort of proved a point and made a statement, and it's forcing everybody, whether they watch Fox or CNN or C-SPAN or MSNBC, wherever you're seeing this, it's forcing you to sort of have an opinion. And I think that conversation is one that's been a long time coming. And I think the very fact that we're having it is successful.
And just because I think people might be in different like levels of like keyed into this, to this, could you, I know it's kind of hard to talk about specific like goals or issues or outcomes, but if you were going to do like a 1-minute book report on Occupy, could you like give us that kind of thing?
No, that's all good. Yeah. No, it's cool. I can handle this. No, well, realistically, the reason that it is Occupy Wall Street is because the initial group that went down there is protesting the involvement of money in politics. And emblematic of that is Wall Street, where a very select group of people has an inordinate amount of sway over the American economy, over the American political system, and things of that nature. What they're protesting is really what we're protesting. I guess I should start including myself in that. What we're protesting is the way money is used in our society and the way people are silenced if they do not have money. So to sort of be really concise, it's everything. It's the way that our food is produced. It's the way that our environment is cared for. It's the way that people are respected. It's the way that schools are run. It's the way that banks are run. It's the way that any social institution that you look at that you feel in some way dissatisfied with. People are down. It's really about dissatisfaction. It's about sort of the profound indifference that the upper echelons of society feel towards the lower end. And I think it's just trying to like scream into the darkness to sort of like say there's so much wrong. We need to start addressing some of it, if that makes sense.
You said there's been different types of conversations, like have they mostly been about like this economic stuff, or stuff about abuse, or?
There's actually a lot going on about race. I mean, it's really interesting. There's a people of color working group that has addressed this sort of situation, that these are problems that the Hispanic and African American community have been wrestling with for 60 years. And now it seems, to some, it seems that as soon as this starts affecting like middle-class white America, and then we all start banging drums. So there is sort of a discussion on the statistics involving race, and there's people talking about poverty, there's people talking about environmental issues. We had a pretty large contingent go down to the White House on the 6th for that Keystone Pipeline thing. There's really like a lot of things being talked about, and it really is sort of a matter of like who you're going to bump into. Some people are championing homosexual issues, recognition in terms of the military, in terms of gay marriage and stuff like that. And so there's really sort of, it sounds like obtuse to say that it's about everything, and it sounds really sort of, I'm not like copping out and saying that it's about all of these things, but for a lot of people it really is. And I think that's sort of the challenge, is to get a large group of people with a diverse agenda to sort of prioritize in the right fashion. And then that's why sort of the message is overall money in politics and people's voices, because those two things sort of not solve, but address this like broad spectrum of issues. So.
That's kind of cliche, but how would you understand like the university or university students' responsible in this?
I'll be honest. I didn't vote the first time I was able to. I was 19. I was actually living in Washington D.C. I was in school, and I was working a couple jobs. I was on a varsity sport, and I had zero time for politics. I was going to school with all these like wannabe senators, and I was just like, okay, cool. I was on that like super self-righteous like I only have one vote, and there's 150 million people, and it doesn't really, statistically, it doesn't count. I live in a blue state, so state goes blue, and like, all right, So like, I mean, it would be wildly hypocritical of me to sit here and tell you, be like, shame, you should be involved. So that's not what I'm doing. What I sort of think is important for college students is to first and foremost understand the ways that you participate in the world. Understand your place in it, and understand the systems that you contribute to. I would assume, just from sitting here, that none of you are terrible people, right? I mean, you don't look particularly vicious. However, the question is, what are things that you do in your daily life that might not contribute to the best possible outcome for society? What are the things that you unwittingly support based on, how you spend your money, where you spend your time, what you end up talking about? Somebody once told me, my friend's sort of a music producer, and we have this like running joke for the last like 15 years. He's like, somebody is buying Britney Spears CDs. Somebody's doing it, right? Somebody's putting these banks in power. Somebody's participating, somebody's reinforcing a white supremacist society. Somebody's supporting a male-dominated society. And so look into it. Figure out what your role in it is. Understand how, when you get up in the morning and go to class, what does that mean? What does it mean to be a college student in America in 2011? Because it puts you in a very elite position in terms of the rest of the world. You're probably top 7% in terms of education globally, just by the nature of the fact that you're sitting at a university. You're probably top 5% economically if you can afford to go to a private American university. So what does it mean to be part of the group then when much is given, much is expected? What is your role in it? Because those were questions that I had to answer for myself. Those were questions that I literally thought I was too busy. Like how self-involved could you possibly be to be like, I don't have time for the rest of the world. I gotta get to the gym, awesome. Or like, I gotta go party, And I'm not, I don't expect you all to be, Franciscans or nuns. I just think it's about sort of analyzing the way you live and figuring out how you participate in these systems, and then trying to creatively find a solution for that involvement, if that makes sense.
Something that really stuck out to me about the Occupy movement is that it doesn't have a leader per se.
Yeah.
So what does that dynamic look like on a practical level?
I mean, realistically, it's super messy. I think it's one of, it takes a lot of the pressure off to have someone tell you what to do. Because you're like, it's not me. It wasn't my fault if it went wrong. It wasn't my fault it didn't work perfectly. So I think the leaderless movement is a really interesting way of putting the onus on everybody. Because no one's like, this is what we should do and this is what we shouldn't do. Everybody has to take ownership of what we do. And everybody has to sort of be involved in what's going on, or it falls to pieces. I mean, there are times when I hate it, to be perfectly honest with you. There are times when I, like go into like an autistic rage where I just want everybody to be quiet for a second and listen to the smartest person in the room. That doesn't happen. But I think why it's really been an interesting experience for me is these movements, these encampments are real reflections of the world you live in. It would be really awesome if we could all live in these like small clusters like Villanova, where everybody was at a certain standard of education and everybody was at a certain standard of living, where there were certain assumptions that you can make. In these like pockets, like you have no idea who the people are. You have no idea how to sort of manage the sea of humanity that's like swirling around you. And because no one's in control of it, you have to navigate that with a sense of responsibility and a sense of accountability that is unlike anything I've ever seen. If I don't answer questions, I mean, I'm pretty tired and pretty cranky. So if I don't answer questions, please be like, you didn't answer my question. Because I hate when people do that. And I feel like I just almost did that. Did I answer your question? Okay. You can be honest. I don't want to pick on you. Yeah.
Earlier you were talking about like the diverse agendas of all the people down there, and like, I imagine at times they are coming into conflict. And I was wondering how that sort of has been playing out.
I mean, realistically, it's been playing out. Like I said, it's messy. It's taking more time to. It's actually, ironically, it's actually like the free market, a legitimately free market where all ideas are being sort of field tested. And if you think you have the solution to all of our problems, you are allowed to go gather people and go do that. If it doesn't work, you are welcome back into the fold to like sheepishly ask for another assignment. People have been arguing, people have been yelling, there are really heated debates. We do have sort of a group of officials, unofficially, to sort of like not participate in, but to moderate conversation. So that's been really helpful. I think it's all good. It's not gonna throw me off. I think it's been really interesting. It's interesting. I mean, we are the city that threw snowballs at Santa Claus. And right now, a homeless encampment at City Hall is the most tolerant place in Philadelphia. Because Muslims are talking to Jews, and homosexuals are talking to straight people, and blacks are talking to Hispanics, and Hispanics are talking to whites, and Chinatown has come out to hang out with West Philly, and there's this like really awesome swirl, but it gets contentious, and there are people with like legitimate priorities, and they fight for them. But because we sort of have been pushing this openness and respect, we've been able to sort of manage the push-pull of that. There's been like a few fights, but not in meetings, and they're sort of like just part of, you know, no more so than happens at Suburban Station every day without the occupation. So there are tense moments, there are people with like wildly divergent ideas, but they're doing a pretty awesome job of keeping everything at a base level of civility that I think is actually higher than an Eagles or a Flyers game.
You just mentioned like Muslims and Jews. I was kind of wondering where like the faith component, or if there was a faith component, how like great it was. I know also like especially in social movements of the past, there have been a lot of faith-based like leaders and stuff that were able to unite a lot of people. And with the lack of a leader, how do you see the faith component contributing?
I think the faith component is motivating certain people to be down there, and I think the faith component is also forcing people of faith to acknowledge their agnostic and atheist brothers and sisters. Because someone with a very strong faith comes down and they start talking to someone and they find out that they don't believe in any particular God, and that's sort of forcing an interesting conversation. In terms of leadership, I think the occupiers and also the world is sort of waiting to see how the faith component plays into it. Because I know the Vatican said something, they addressed it in some sort of way. And I'm sure you guys, we're in the campus ministry building, so I'm sure you're familiar with sort of liberation theology and things of that sort. I think a faith component right now, because we're dealing with such a diverse group, I think the faith component is going to have to interject itself from outside, because people are bringing individual faith to it, and that's, I think, where people are finding common ground in terms of the Jew, Muslim, Christian, Buddhist. Everybody's there, everybody cares, and so it's sort of like as long as your faith overall is in that there is a better way to proceed and that you would like to see a greater level of justice in the world we live in, that's sort of faith enough to further the conversation. So I mean, it's really meaningful for a lot of people down there, why they're there, their faith that brings them there and stuff like that. It's also like it doesn't mean anything for certain people down there. So again, I think that element will come from outside as opposed to blossoming from in, if that makes sense.
I'm just kind of wondering like what a typical day kind of like looks like in the camp. Like I know you mentioned the meetings, so that's happening like all day, or can anyone just, is it like a central location, or can anyone just come to them? Or?
Yeah, everybody is welcome at every meeting, whether you're on a committee or not. Again, they're called movements for a reason because they change. I know Occupy Wall Street went from having a general assembly every night to having one once a week because they started going into like 6 hours, and so you can't, people have jobs. So if they do, right? Some people, not all. See, I love this crowd, keep me honest. So what does a typical day look like? I mean, it's sort of a slow moving kind of, people get up slowly because there's a little bit of a festivity atmosphere to it. People hang out pretty late in the night and get into conversations. There's, some drugs and some booze bandied about. So it goes pretty late, but it is in the middle of a major city. And so it starts pretty late. It's sort of like really funny to watch the morning rush hour of like civil servants in suits. Kind of everybody's coming up, and there's like homeless people like washing in front of their tents. So it's slow moving in the morning. At about noon, everybody's up and sort of manning their stations. And if your group calls for a meeting on a given day, there's an information tent with like a schedule of events. We're trying to do marches every weekend and different sort of action. So everybody, it's kind of wild because there's like a lot of moving parts. There's a food station that has like 3 times for meals. There's a medic station that is open for certain hours. So every day is sort of very typical. Every day is sort of like totally off the wall. So we're trying to gear things towards weekends where outside participation, it's a lot easier for people to come and sort of be there. But there's a sort of like a 9 to 5 atmosphere to it. Only the 9 to 5 is like 12 to 10, if that makes sense. Everybody's like at their little table, kind of hanging out for, clocking in. So.
Can you explain a little bit about what's going to be going on next July and what some of the goals of the, I believe they're calling it convention happening somewhere? I read about it on the Occupy Philly website.
Okay.
But it's like July 4th, they're planning on having a bunch of different groups.
There's okay. See, this is what's awesome. There's so much energy down there, and there's so much like big, super awesome ideas that it's like really contagious, and people get like way ahead of themselves. So talking about next July when we're facing a possible eviction on the 14th of November, 3 days from now, is a little bit, to call it superfluous would be generous. I think that one of the things to realize is that this is moving really fast. That 4 girls got pepper sprayed on a street corner in Lower Manhattan, and the size of that particular occupation doubled. There are now 2,100 cities around the world that have small encampments. There are 12 people camping out in Allentown. There are 50 people camping out in front of the State House in Harrisburg. So in terms of like long-term planning, somebody is really doing a good job of keeping the idea ball rolling, but then there's this like other side of it that's like more pragmatic in the sense that everything that we're planning has to be really fluid because things are changing. Things change by the day. When that guy got tear gassed in Oakland, everything changed. When they took the bridge in New York, everything changed. And so I don't know how much you guys, how like aware of like these sort of power politics of social demonstrations, but because of the nature of the action-reaction and based on the response of certain governments, everything has to remain like really fluid and evolve. And so I think realistically what's going to happen in terms of how we move forward is how well each of these groups connects with everybody else nationally. They do have an Occupy website up that is posting the larger stories of the day. But I really think in terms of having looked at other social movements in the past, and this is by no means my expertise, but there are defining moments in social movements that either galvanize the population at large or don't. And right now we're sitting on sort of the ledge of how this thing grows. Because, I mean, winter in Philadelphia sucks. And so it's going to get really cold really fast. And it's colder in Manhattan, and it's colder in Boston, and it's colder in Chicago. So the idea of like looking ahead at 3 months of like legitimate cold is a really interesting aspect of this in terms of how we survive the winter, how we survive March. You know, so I can't really speak to what's going to go on July 4th. I have a feeling that within the next 2 weeks, 3 weeks, something is going to change that's going to sort of funnel the direction of everybody towards one point. There's a group of kids left New York yesterday. There were 26 people walking, and they're going to stop in Trenton and try to pick up some, and they're going to stop in Camden and try to pick up some. And their plan is to make it to DC for the super committee budget meeting announcement on the 23rd. That's sort of as far ahead as I'm willing to look, because I think with Black Friday coming up, with the start of construction down at City Hall and things of that sort, I think there's going to be a sort of a scramble and then a back together again before. So to say something's going to happen in July, I can't even tell you if my tent's going to be there when I get back.
This is all occurring sort of during the Arab Spring, and I was curious how much you thought that's affected or inflamed the situation, or is there discussion happening about that? Is there any connections?
I think, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of, I think there was a bunch of people that held a solidarity march with us in Tahrir Square on the day after the kid got tear gassed in Oakland, which is really kind of crazy when you think about I mean, yeah, it was a pro-American Arab democracy, but they marched for us. I think the way that Tahrir Square contributed to it is, I think this is sort of like a gut check for a lot of Americans in terms of when you think about the rights that we're afforded as citizens, just being born here, and then you look at people that are facing militarized, systematic oppression on a level that we can't even really imagine. It's sort of like, if they could do it, why are we getting pushed around? If they can do it in spite of all the things that stands in their way, why are we, you know? And for a lot of people, I think they sort of, the gut check was like, I am a fat, stupid, lazy American. I sit here and I am in the midst of so much, and everybody recognizes, everybody that you know recognizes a social ill. I don't know what it is, but every single person you have ever met in your entire life is able to look at society and say, yeah, that's wrong. What's really interesting about it is how their behavior does or does not change based on it. And I think when those kids took over Tahrir Square, when a fruit seller in Tunisia was like, dude, no, I'm not going to put up with it anymore. I think that really sort of forced a lot of people to look at what they're doing with their own lives, what sort of subjugation and oppression they're living with. And I think it made a lot of people mad. And I think a lot of people are looking at it as in like, if they can do it in the face of all of those things, why can't we? If they can fight for a better world and win in their corner of the world, what are we doing? We're watching American Idol, we're buying huge cars, we're burning through all this gas, we're destroying, you know, we've leveled the world economy, we're melting the ice caps and all of these things. And it's like I'm not saying all of them, whether you agree with me or not on any of them, everybody you know sees one problem. And the question is, what are you doing to fix it? Or are you just saying like, yeah, I got a decent house, my television is big and flat and skinny, and so I'm just gonna be cool with that. I think it was a gut check. And I think people are responding to it.
Maybe one more question.
I started with the two It's sort of a practical and logistical and not very exciting question. But if, as students, we wanted to come down and bear witness to what's going on, how would we do that? Like, take down the train, get off the station?
That's it, yeah. I mean, that sounds like, yeah, I don't want to be like cavalier, but yeah, go see how the other half lives. Go sort of be bold and go down and talk to people. Go down and meet people and see what they're there for and share your opinions. I mean, what's crazy, there's a really interesting sort of dichotomy between what's happening and what's being portrayed as happening. And there is a very valid concern in terms of like a leaderless movement without a preset agenda, like what's going to happen there, you know, and I agree with those concerns. What I find really interesting is people with a lot of skills and people with a lot of knowledge and people who have a lot to give, or for whatever reason, they're a little bit afraid to come down and give. And I think you guys probably have some really good ideas. I think you have a particular perspective on the world that needs to be shared. And I think that everybody benefits from hearing that. And I think this is a really unique opportunity for you as young people to, I don't want to say like participate in the world that's being created, but something is happening. And I think you can either, you know, you can make time for certain things in your life, or you can make time to go down and participate in one of the wilder social experiments that has been happening in the last 40 years. So just show up. I mean, I'm easy to find. I'm tall, I have a huge beard, you know, and I wear the same thing just about every day. So come down and say hello to me, take a book off my table, and contribute in the way that, in whatever way you think will solve the problem that is most meaningful to you. Because that's how people are solving problems down there. They're figuring out what means the most to them, and they're trying to get other people on their side.
So there's been a lot of talk about this being a leaderless movement. Mm-hmm. So I was wondering, in the Occupy movement, is there a call for one leader? Or is it more of an emphasis for a call for billions of leaders to rise up and enact change in their local communities? What's being pushed there?
I think it's a. I think the push is towards a leaderless billion people movement. I think it initially started as, there's that group, hackers called Anonymous, and they were sort of pushing it. And there's a group called Adbusters from Canada. They run this magazine. They were sort of calling it. So nobody really knows like who the first people were. I think there's a really interesting, there's an interesting like paranoia to it, where you know what COINTELPRO is? We're back in the 60s yeah, you did. Again, I'm stepping out of my expertise here if I have any, and into sort of, I'll play intellectual for a second. And in the 60s, they were doing stuff like checking out books people were reading in the libraries and sort of starting FBI files, case jackets on like who was and was not a leader. And Fred Hampton got shot in the middle of Chicago with 2 other people by police, which it was essentially an American soil assassination by the government. A really kind of interesting thing to read up on. So there's this like level of paranoia where Abby Hoffman went crazy, and sort of the Black Panthers, some of them ran to Africa and some of them went to jail, and so there's the concept of like you can kill a revolutionary, but you can't kill a revolution. I think there's sort of 2 elements to it, where there is this sort of like odd paranoia of Big Brother, where which is legitimate because people are being thrown off their web servers, people are being kicked out of their email accounts, and there's like some weird stuff happening online that, you know, it's kind of suspicious when we like tisk the Egyptians for shutting down Facebook. We're doing very similar things here. So there's that paranoia, but there's also, I think more important is the push for ownership, where like, I love sitting down there, you know, it's like you get up in the morning and you're sleeping on concrete, it's freezing. And some dude in a suit, he's like, you know what you guys need to do? And it's like, awesome, dude. Like, why don't you do it? Because I'm doing this, you know? And so I think there is that sort of overarching theme where the more ownership everyone takes, the more we have to drive. Like, because I think it's really sort of a master play in the sense where it's like, you know, we're asking everybody to be involved. We're asking everybody to take ownership of it. We're asking everybody to sort of feel a part of it. When there is no leader, you got nobody to blame but yourself. So.
All right, well, thank you.
You got it. Thanks for having me.
I really don't want to follow the Pat show, but I'm going to follow the Pat show because I wrote down more things that Pat said than I do about things that I say. Thank you for that introduction. That's great. Just to give you an idea about how I see my roles, yes, all of that stuff is true, and I'm a researcher and I'm a professor here. I've been here. This is my 3rd semester. All of that is true. But I'm also an activist, and I've been an activist for a long time before I was ever an academic. And I worked most closely with peace and human rights organizations in North Carolina, specifically North Carolina Stop Torture Now, North Carolina Peace Action, Code Pink, and Witness Against Torture, which is actually a national organization, but have chapters all over the country. So that's sort of I get to wear 2 hats, and I am particularly lucky to have the kind of job that lets me wear those 2 hats all the time, where I can go do research and get to be an activist and get to be a part of the wild party and the festive thing and get to actually say, hey, I'm working. So that's nice for me. I've heard a lot of really good questions, and I got some questions that you guys wrote down that they asked me to sort of address, but before I kind of get to that, I want to ask you those questions because I want to get sort of your ideas about how you think about social movements. And we can think about this from what you've read about Occupy currently, what you know about historical movements, US movements, internationally, whatever your sort of background knowledge or not on any of that is. So I keep hearing this question like, when's it going to be successful? And I love Pat's response that it already is, because I completely agree. The fact that it exists at all, to me, is a success, number one, right off the bat. But I want to know what you think. What is a successful movement? What are some examples of when somebody says, hey, what's a successful social movement? What comes to your mind? Like, what's the sort of example for you? And you can just yell it out. You don't have to raise your hand. Civil rights movement. Is that everybody's answer?
Women's rights.
The women's rights movement. Which one?
Oh, suffrage.
Suffrage. So not maybe the 70s-ish version? 60s, 70s?
70s is pretty good.
Okay. Maybe both in different ways. Anything else? Is it because those are the only 2 we kind of study in school? Maybe. And that's okay too. So what about failures? What if you had to come up with the one that was a failure, which if you never heard of it, it probably was a failure, but maybe you've heard of one that you said, that was a failure. That didn't ever really get off the ground. Any of those pop into your head? Prohibition. Good one. Good one. I hadn't even thought of that. Excellent example. But we still read about it. And it was it got a constitutional amendment. When's the last time that happened? But boy, that didn't last long. Yeah, so maybe longevity is an issue. So how do you know? What makes them successful? So I just said something about longevity, and maybe that's sort of the kicker for saying, prohibition, not so much.
What is it? Well, I think like one thing that we find often is that like during the civil rights movement or during like any movement, we seek to have someone, whoever's like in power, like admit that it's successful, or that's something that's either written down in the history books or that it's been taken as a success. And if that doesn't happen, then we have the people during like a revolution, like those who come into power say it's success. So someone has to deem it a success, and usually it has to be the people that you're looking up to, like to see it. Like you don't usually get the idea that how Pat said, like where he already thinks it's successful, and that you have this combined idea of that's successful, unless like most people think that it has to come from like a legitimate source, which is usually from power structure.
So if I said it was, did that give it more legitimacy because I said it was a success? Gosh, I hope not. I don't want to be that person yet. But no, I think you're onto something here, right? That when some power that be says, oh yeah, that was a success. So if the civil rights movement was your example, or the women's rights movement was your example for a successful movement, who told you that? Who was the power that be in that sort of scheme?
I mean, I think about it like civil rights, like, or like Martin Luther King, you know, like they'll say like, oh, his dream was successful, you know, and I mean, I don't know if it, I don't think it's like been successful to like the vision that he had it, but it's like in terms of like history and like how people write about it, you know, or different things like that.
I think when we see legislation come out of movements, that's usually deemed like a mark of success because the legislation means the government said like, yes, this is a big enough deal that we have to do something about it. And from what Mark was saying about the idea of the power structures having to admit that there was a success, that legislation is, I think, a key mark of that.
Okay.
I kind of think at a more basic level, like there's a change in whatever the way things used to be. So like the Occupy movement now, like people are actually openly talking about these issues in a big form, or like the women's rights movement, like now women can vote. Like there's even if there wasn't like a big thing, like now you're engaging in conversation and there's a change.
Other comments, suggestions, questions about that?
I think a lot of people define, I guess, movements or whatever. Like if you look back in history, how we define like how a war was successful, we have clear winners and losers in a situation. So I think a lot of people think in terms of that, like, oh, we have winners and then we have losers in this movement, and like that defines whether it's successful or not. I think a good way to define it is by the goals we set for something. If we can get this attained or that, not even like the long term, but just like short-term goals to get up to where that long term is, I think it's a great way to define how something is successful, especially involving the movement.
Okay. So I'm hearing a lot of sort of different ways of thinking about this, about who gets to say it's a success or failure. The who of that is important. We have small-term goals versus long-term goals, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute as well. Maybe we judge it according to a law. Maybe we judge it according to how something has changed historically. So I am not, I too was not the best math person, and I am not a quantitative kind of person. I don't go out and count stuff. What I look at is how people talk about things, which is why I'm so excited about the Occupy movement, because that's the heart of what's going on, is having people talk about things, public issues that affect them, that affect other people. And so for me, I'm more interested in that sort of thing than being able to count that sort of stuff. So when you're talking about things like policy changes and new laws, we need to think about these in different ways. So we need to think about systemic changes versus sort of these sort of policy changes. So Martin Luther King's dream, let's start with that. His dream was pretty broad, ending racism. There are women's movements that are about ending sexism, gay rights movements that are about ending homophobia, lots of movements about ending classism, whether it's in regards to labor, in terms of socioeconomic status, equal distribution of recognition, equal distribution of money, of resources, environmental protection, all of these kinds of things. Well, how do you measure that? We have an EPA. Does that mean that the environmental protection movement was successful? It's one of those ones Rick Perry wants to get rid of. It's always under attack. We got the Voting Rights Act in 1965. We good? We good on racism? Martin Luther King's dream? Success? I don't know about that. Women? We're good? No patriarchy. We're good? No, not so much. Gay rights? Maybe not so much. Equal distribution? Equal recognition? No. So we have to think about things like success and failure in different ways. We can't think about success solely in terms of goal fulfillment either, because movements have effects beyond what is intended all the time. Movements have unintended effects, whether for good or for ill. So things like marches and protests and rallies, how do you judge the success of something like that? How do you judge whether it was effective or has a social impact? So when I talk about that in terms of communication, I talk about that in terms of things like that. Their goal is not to produce immediate political effects like passing laws or ending policies, because you can't ever start there, right? You have to build communities first, which is what Occupy is doing, right? They want to get the voices, they want to get the information, they want to get the ideas. You have to build a community of informed activists in order to empower that future participation. We didn't start by passing the Voting Rights Act in 1965. We started with 4 people sitting at a lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina, or even before that, right? We started with abolition of slavery. We started with all kinds of much, much smaller things. We started with probably a group of people in a room like this, talking about, hey, what's our one social ill and what are we going to do about it? That's never recorded in a history book, that's never going to be dubbed successful by some power, right? That maybe is just ephemeral and it's gone, right? There was no media coverage of it, there was no Twitter feed about it, it's gone. But all of those small points, right, are important because power operates in multiple points, right? It comes from all different places. It's not just the government, it's not just the economist, it's not just the banks, it's not just this person or the rich or that person. It comes from all kinds of places. So we have to have small points of resistance, right? Where there is power, there is resistance, right? So all of those little small scale things that might not seem important build, right? Towards a larger sort of goal, multiplier effects, right? So sit-ins in the civil rights movement. Think about Occupy. We started with some people, actually I would kind of say if I had to pinpoint where I think it sort of started, I think Arab Spring had something to do with it, but I think that what happened in Wisconsin against the Governor Scott Walker with the union breaking and that sort of thing, I think that's where some of this started getting momentum. Then it kind of moved. Wall Street, Philly, Oakland, San Francisco, how many did you say, 2,100? 2,100 cities. And how many months? 2 at the most? Are we about 2, 3? Yeah, 2, not even 2. How does something so small get picked up in all of these other places, reiterated in all of these little spaces? It's amazing, right? Multiplier effects. Was that the goal? Probably not. I don't know. Unintended effects happen all the time. Things like teach-ins, working groups, petitions, you just sending an email to your friend about something, all of that stuff provokes critical reflection about different social issues, even if it's just for one person, right? These sort of small things keep moving across space. It moves so much faster now because of media. One of the questions I think that they gave me was about the role of social media. I think there's some good and some ill from social media and the sort of mass of information that we have all the time, but one is just the speed. The civil rights movement sit-ins, they kind of had to use the phone, like a real rotodial, pick up the phone kind of deal, right? So it moved much slower, but it still moved. So I want to talk a little bit about this leaderless movement thing, because I heard a lot of stuff about that as well, but I want you to think about that in sort of a relationship to what you've been studying here, Greenleaf, that's this guy's name, yes? So Greenleaf, I looked him up, and I Googled him, and I learned that he said, and this is a loose quotation, that a better society is one that provides greater creative opportunity for its people. I cannot think of a better example of that than the Occupy movement. A greater creative opportunity for its people to express themselves. So when the media kind of talks about things like leaders and leadership movements, they sort of think about this in terms of a spokesperson who speaks for the whole group. Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, Alice Paul, Susan B. Anthony, all of those kind of people, right? That sort of speak for others. they don't think about leadership in the nuanced way that Greenleaf does when he talks about servant leadership, all right? And I don't think they talk about leadership in the way that Occupy people think about leadership and leaders. So when I think about leaderless movements, I think about this in terms of referring to the fact that we're all equally accountable and a part of the process of decision making, which is exactly what Pat was talking about, right? Instead of handing over that decision to a leader or a spokesperson, we are all equally accountable and a part of that process of decision making. So when you see sort of, this is a leaderless movement, they don't have any coherent message, they don't have somebody we can go talk to and stick the microphone in their face, that's the strength, that's not a weakness. But it's always going to be portrayed as a weakness, right? In certain circles. So I think Pat said somewhere towards the end, like, what's happening down there is not the same thing as what's portrayed as happening. And that to me is one of the main things that you can do as students, if you want to know what you can do, is when you come up against misinformation, when you come up against sort of accounts like that you tell people, well, no, actually, this is what that means. This is what a leaderless movement looks like, and these are the positive things about it. And yeah, it's messy, and I know consensus decision making is incredibly frustrating, but it is also incredibly effective in a lot of ways. So think about leadership as being willing to participate equally, to communicate with others, or to serve others, because that's part of your sort of goal here, right? This servant leadership thing, serving others by participating in democracy, right? So participating in a democracy in sort of activist-oriented ways, not just voting, not just, those sort of writing a letter to a congressperson and all that, not that that stuff's not important, but I also would be wildly hypocritical if I said, go out and do this kind of stuff, because I certainly didn't do it when I was your age. I was quite late to that game as well. But you're here, so I think maybe you're somewhat interested in that. Those kinds of things are my way of sort of being in the world, right? Being an activist is my way of being in the world. For Greenleaf, it's servant leadership, right? It's a way of being in the world. So you need to think about, again, along the same lines as what Pat said, what is your way of being in the world? And is it a way that is ethical and responsible and thinks about others, right? Those are the kinds of questions you have to ask yourself, right? Because nobody's going to answer those questions for you. I talked about this at the panel that we did the other night about Occupy, that I met this woman named Grace Lee Boggs who just completely changed my life. And she's an activist in Detroit. She's in her 90s now and has been an activist since she moved to this country. She's an Asian immigrant. And she was interviewed on PBS, and she said, positive changes, leaps forward in the evolution of humankind do not start with governments. That we are the leaders that we are looking for. So I have seen leaders in the most unlikely of places, in a tent, in a homeless shelter, right, in the middle of the street, a leader that's not waiting for a government official or a presidential candidate to come in and save their community or to solve the social ills. The leaders that are creating things like urban gardens or general assemblies or public art, all of those people that love their communities and their country and are trying to save it and make it better despite how angry they are, despite how hopeless they might feel, that all of that they're still willing to be a part of something and to sort of be a part of that solution. And sometimes I think maybe leadership's not the right word, that maybe participation is the right word, but I'm still sort of working on that. So that's just sort of my bag. I also know a little bit about media coverage of this, and I'm happy to talk to you about how the media covers, or particularly the mainstream media covers social movements historically and with Occupy. That's what I've been following a lot. So if you have questions about that, I can talk about that, but I know you guys are kind of on a schedule, so I don't want to take up too much of your time. But now I just want you to ask me questions, or ask each other questions. Mm-hmm.
I do have a question about the media. Like, why would the media not want to portray this as truthfully as they could? Like, I just feel like I know there's a lot of like conflicting like biases and such in the media, but I just don't see the merit in discrediting a movement when I feel the media is like the whole idea is supposed to be to uphold the truth to the greatest extent, but there's so much like slant that the truth isn't getting out there. Like, why is this happening? I don't know. Like, I know that's like a kind of an unanswerable question to an extent, but.
Oh, I don't think it's a question.
Well, I think we have, in recent years, we've had this sort of, Fox News is for the conservatives, and CNN's for the liberals, and MSNBC's for the uber liberals, and whatever. and so those kinds of news organizations have an agenda. They have an agenda. I don't have any doubt of that. And on their agenda is not necessarily reporting the truth. But all media, whether it's a newspaper, a news magazine, a web page, whatever, or one of the big 3 networks, one of the smaller local news networks, how do they get out information? What are they using? On the most basic level, what are they doing? They're talking, right? They're using language. And when you talk, like I get kind of antsy when people start talking about the truth or the facts, because all language is inherently biased, because all language has a connotation, right? So calling it a movement puts it in a specific category in your mind. I saw an editorial that called it a jamboree. That puts you in a whole different frame of mind, right? Calling it an occupation, calling it a protest, calling it a demonstration, aligning it with a particular set of values, all of those things slant the truth in different ways, right? Because we all kind of put our own connotative sort of mind on that sort of thing, right? Meaning is sort of co-created in that way. So why they do it? Some have an agenda. Some, it's just the nature of language in general. It's the nature of images in general, right? When you show a picture of a group of a set of tents in a park versus a group of protesters with big, huge American flags wearing military uniforms, those evoke different emotions in a viewer. And those choices are strategic. So I'm not a big sort of fan of saying that the media is not biased, because you can't, that to me doesn't really exist, right? So I think that's sort of the nature of how it is in some ways.
We actually have been talking about that in one of my classes, and it's also just the contribution. I mean, in addition to that, I never even thought about that as a reason for the biases, but a media is a corporation. The media is trying to get advertisements so that they can stay on the air if they're a TV show, or to continue to be able to print and stuff. So they need money too. So they're trying to attract money, attract people viewing it, and so they're looking at like who their consumer is, because in the end, like they are a business, they need consumers at the same time. So like they're trying to like get the information out there, but they're trying to do it in a way that the people consuming their news broadcastings are more likely to view it. And so like with respect to different stories, news stories and whatnot, they'll like focus on the like one person who has this like 8 babies and like, oh my God, like this is ridiculous, instead of looking at like broader, long-term like issues that you need to like delve into like deeper thought about it, because that's not so exciting for somebody consuming that. So they're kind of biased in what they pick and choose so that they can make more money, which is really unfortunate. But
so you have to think about your way of being in the world. How do you consume media? Why is it that a news organization believes that they will get more revenue dollars if they put a show with two, the right and the left screaming at each other the whole time? What is it about our sort of what we tune into that perpetuates that sort of media, right? That says it's about the left and the right, the black and the white. It's this dichotomous view of the world. We put people in those kinds of positions for a reason, right? Politicians do this with their language. Movement leaders do this with their language. The media does this with their language. They do it in order to put you in sort of this state of combativeness, right? Because when you are in a fight, when it's just react, right? Because it's me against them, right? You don't have time to think about all that gray stuff that might be in between, or maybe that there are more than 2 ways to solve this problem. Maybe there are 7 billion ways to solve this problem. I don't have time to think about that though, because it's me against them, right? And we want if we're in a position of power, We want people to make snap decisions. We don't want them thinking about all that critical thinking stuff that they try to teach you in college, right? We don't want you thinking about what other ideas might be, because then you might not make the decision they want you to make, right? Does that make sense? The media is no less guilty of that. They feed into that system. That said, I don't want to say, oh, it's all the media's fault, because at no other time in history have people been more a part of the media than they are now. I bet you maybe 2 people in this room might raise their hand if I say, how many of your phones don't have a camera? See, not even 2. I don't even think you can buy a phone that doesn't have a camera on it anymore, or a video camera, or a direct feed to the internet, right? All of this stuff, all of the videos that are out there of everything that's going on, the pictures that are being taken, the blogs, the tweeting, the status updates, all of that, you've become a part of that. Now, there can be negatives of that because it's information overload, but it's also a huge quantity of diversity. So many more diverse opinions, so much more access to getting information and opinions and values out there. To me, the people's ability to film and photograph and distribute all of that is what keeps movements like Occupy going, what keeps ideas flowing, right? That provokes that sort of critical reflection that we need to talk about democratic issues. So don't always demonize the media, be a part of it. Other questions, either about the media or other stuff?
I guess an impression I've had is that like mainstream media is like, on both sides. You know, you're mentioning the idea of like right versus left, but it seems that both sides have been somewhat dismissive of the Occupy movement. I'm just wondering if you could speak to why that's been the case.
I'm not sure why. I can give my opinion on it. I seem to have the impression that Occupy is actually very diverse in terms of age, in terms of race, in terms of gender, ethnicity, all of that sort of stuff. But I tend to see news coverage that focuses on, these young, dissatisfied young people that won't go out and get a job. You, as a segment of the population, tend to get discredited more than so many others because you're young and idealistic, or you're young and stupid, or you're young and you can't make choices, or you're young and you're so influenced by your crazy professors, or something you read, or some crazy thing you read, right? You get discredited all the time, right? And it drives me crazy to no end that 18 to 22-year-olds, 18 to 24-year-olds, however you want to think about that. And I'm not just talking about college students, but college-age students, because you don't have to just be in college to be a smart person that reads and has opinions and thinks critically. You're demonized all the time. And it's very easy to discredit anything that pushes against the status quo, right? Anything that says, this is not right. It's so easy to discredit it when you can zoom a camera in on a group of young people with beards and flannel shirts. And I'm just teasing you. I'm that person too. If I didn't have to be at Villanova today, I'd be dressed like that too. But I probably wouldn't have a beard. I shaved. But it's so easy to focus in on that, right? And completely discredit the fact that you're adults that can vote and make decisions, right? That you can think about issues and that you do have something to contribute. And that's what they don't like about the Occupy movement, is people in the Occupy movement saying, we think everybody has something that they can contribute to this, and we're willing to listen to it. That pushes against every sort of status quo, every sort of seat of power. And people get real nervous when you start talking about changing things. We don't want to change things. I don't want to have to give up my luxuries and my privilege, right? I don't want people to question that. So I don't know the exact reason why, but I think that's part of what it is discrediting that which pushes against the status quo, which resists. Other questions, comments? Yeah.
Well, I got the opportunity to chat with you a little bit about this earlier in the week, but could you just speak to the way in which kind of speech and space play out in the Occupy movement?
Sure. So my research hat I study public space, and I study how regulations of space and surveillance of space, so when you're talking about COINTELPRO and paranoia, that's my bag, how that affects protests and how that affects how people can express themselves in public space. And one of the smartest things that I have seen come out of the Occupy movement, and there's a lot of smart stuff, one of the smartest things is their ability to articulate this as a freedom of assembly. Because we talk about the First Amendment a lot, and we say, oh, freedom of expression or freedom of speech or freedom of the press, and we kind of forget about that freedom of assembly thing. In order to assemble a group of people, you have to have a public space. And we have eroded public space in our country. Think about what public spaces are left. The only ones that really are left are completely consumer driven, right? The mall, and not that we don't all love Starbucks, but the Starbucks, that sort of stuff, right? So where are the public spaces where we can actually assemble? And what Occupy is saying is that we as citizens have a right to this space, and no one has a right to the city more than a homeless person, because they don't have anywhere else to be, and they have the right to the city. And Occupy is saying we all have a right to this public space to get together and talk about things. This is our right as citizens. When you start talking about it in terms of free speech, historically the Supreme Court has been really good at protecting free speech, content-wise, right? They'll protect your free speech as far as your content is concerned. But what they're going to do is they're going to support regulations of space, laws about space, that sort of control the form. So you can talk about whatever you want, but you can't do it over here. And you can't do it right there because you might be disrupting these people. You can do it in that free speech zone over there. We'll even build you a nice little cage that you can get in that's way far away from where the action is. You've seen those kind of things, right? Free speech zones, stuff like that. So they're not regulating the content, they're regulating the form, right? Where you can do it, how you can do it, how close you can be to somebody, how close you can be to a particular city hall or a monument or something like that. What communication people talk about is you can't separate those things. You can't separate the form from the content, right? Because that matters. And so being able to say it in this space, assembling in this space, is an important right that I think the Occupy movement has been really good about articulating this as their right. Because freedom of speech, they'll say, well, why can't you go talk about it over there, out of the way, so I don't have to look at it or smell it, right? Or hear it. But when we start saying that we shouldn't have to hear things that we don't agree with, we're really on a slippery slope, really into some scary territory. So these issues of freedom of assembly versus freedom of speech become very important, and the Occupy movement's done a good job, I think, of articulating this as an assembly right and a right to public space, because we have not had that right, and it has been eroded most, I would argue, from my research, since September 11th, because public space is considered a threat. It is considered insecure, right? It's not a secure space. It's not safe. We need to regulate it. We need to control it. We need to have police officers there, body scanners, and dogs, and all kinds of stuff, right? So we have an increased regulation of those spaces, which affects people's free speech in ways that they don't tend to think about. Is that what you were, like, that's what we talked about the other day? Yeah. That's my bag. I could go on about that, too, for a long time, because I get real upset when they put people in cages. So, no, go ahead. I was just going to say, so this vote that the Occupy Philly people are facing, it's so crucial, and it's going to be, I'm really interested to see what happens, because it's going to be a big game changer. Like you said, it's going to definitely be one of those points where we're going to see how this kind of changes as the movement evolves, because they're going to have to make a decision if they're going to continue to be in a certain space or if they're going to move to another space, and what that means for what they're saying and what they're expressing. So it's going to be, I would definitely pay attention.
Well, thank you.
Sure.